David, we hear a lot about worsening climate science projections and that climate change is happening a lot more rapidly than first predicted. We're now more than a year on from the publication of the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I guess has given us the most recent overarching picture of what we can expect. And I think it'd be fair to say that that report was both worrying in terms of what we're facing and, in the minds of climate scientists, far too conservative. We're now a couple of weeks away from what's effectively an emergency climate summit that's being held by scientists and economists in Copenhagen, which will attempt to update the science to give us a better picture of where we're at. What are we likely to hear from that?
That's a long question to answer. So there's lots of different parts to the answers to that question. Let me just start with maybe the IPCC. It is in fact now 2 years, almost exactly, since the Climate Change Science Assessment was released in January of 2007. I think that you're absolutely right. That did provide a whole range of, the latest climate science information. I don't think that climate scientists felt that it was, if you like, underestimated the risks and underestimated the changes, because the process of that leads to the IPCC assessments necessarily has to be a consensus approval process amongst more than 100 governments around the world. And that means that the conclusions from that assessment represent the best understanding of the science at the time, but the full range of uncertainties or complexities of the science are probably buried in the detail, and maybe the one-liners or the three-liners that we get used in the media don't necessarily fully represent the uncertainties and perhaps the worst-case scenarios in the climate science. What we've seen in the most recent science publications in a number of different areas are that these recent scientific assessments or publications of climate changes in a number of different areas have been happening at, if you like, the upper range or the worst case often in the range of the previous IPCC assessment. So let me talk about a couple of examples. One of those would be Arctic sea ice retreat. The IPCC concluded that Arctic sea ice had been decreasing rapidly over the past 20 to 30 years, included information only up to about 2005 and 2006, in fact only up to 2005. An assessment in a publication immediately after that reported that the rate of observed reduction up to 2005 was occurring more rapidly than any of the IPCC climate models predicted. And then in 2007, a new record low for summertime sea ice coverage in the Arctic was observed from satellite data. And that was 20% below the previous record that had been set in 2005. So that was indicating that there was even more rapid reductions, that the rate of decrease in summertime sea ice in the Arctic was occurring faster than any of the climate model projections. And that suggests that either the climate models are no good, but lots of other indications suggest that the climate models for large-scale patterns of variation are in fact performing very well, but maybe the processes relevant for the Arctic sea ice are not well enough represented. Unfortunately, the faster decrease in Arctic sea ice indicates faster warming, and it's a positive feedback. Less sea ice means less reflection of sunlight, which means more absorption of sunlight, which means faster warming. It's a feedback process that amplifies the warming. But that's not the only indication of a faster rate of change. Other things that have been occurring more relevant to here in southern Australia is that the rate of decrease of rainfall over the last decade in Australia is occurring faster than any of the climate models would predict as the best estimate for reductions in rainfall, say for decadal averages in the first decade of the 21st century. We're right in the first decade of the 21st century, and the rates of decreases we've seen over the last 30 years have been really very rapid. They're more consistent with the worst case scenario of rapid decreases for the 2050s. In other words, the rate of rainfall decrease is right at the extreme of rainfall decreases, not for the first decade of the 21st century, but maybe 5, decades or more into the future. Another change that's been happening faster than the IPCC projections is the rate of increases of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the rate of emissions due to burning of fossil fuels. Human activity has been very successful at utilising fossil fuels for energy and burning fossil fuels. And we're seeing again that the rate of increase of emissions due to burning fossil fuels and emissions into the atmosphere of carbon dioxide have been occurring more rapidly than even the worst case IPCC scenario. And that's led to faster growth of carbon dioxide concentrations than in any of the IPCC scenarios for this period in the 21st century.
Can I bring you back to the Arctic for a second?
Sure.
It's, I guess, the cliched canary in the coal mine for a lot of people on climate change. 2007, as you said, is the worst year, certainly in memory. And 2008 was, as I understand it, in terms of ice retreat, bad, but not as bad as 2007. And this has had all sorts of interpretations within the mainstream media and the general public. How much of what happened in 2007 may be due to natural variation?
Sure.
How much of it can we directly attribute to climate change? And what does it mean, if anything, when the following year ice retreat isn't as great?
Sure. So let me just talk about, if you like, the observations. We know from satellite observations over the last 20 to 30 years and longer term observations from ships and from land-based stations that the ice cover in the 21st century, in the last 10 years, is dramatically less than it was 20, 30 and 50 years ago. There aren't good observations of ice aerial extent 100 years ago. So we've only got a relatively short period of high quality observations over an extended area. When we look at that, we do see this pronounced decreasing trend over the last 30 years and over the last 50 years. But superimposed on that long-term decreasing trend are quite large year-to-year variations associated with changes in the wind patterns and the ocean currents and the cloud cover. So it is likely that, if you like, natural weather variations caused some of the rapid decrease in 2007 and also contributed to the slight recovery in 2008. But if we try to set 2008 in context with all the previous years prior to 2007, if we hadn't had 2007, 2008 would have been a new record minimum in Arctic sea ice extent. So yes, there was a small increase in the aerial coverage in 2008 relative to 2007, but 2008 was still dramatically less, more than 10% less than the previous minimum set in 2005. So yes, there's been a slight recovery, but in no way has the Arctic sea ice recovered to where it was, typically in the 1990s or even in the early 2000s. So another new analysis has in fact done a quantitative assessment of how much of the retreat in Arctic sea ice over the last 30 and the last 50 years is due to increasing greenhouse gases and how much is due to natural variations. Not the year-to-year variations, but the long-term trend. And it finds that, if you like, most of the retreat, almost all of the retreat, is due to increases in greenhouse gases, and it is not possible to explain the observed decrease in the last 30 or the last 50 years due to natural variability like changes in the circulation or changes in the ocean currents, or another factor which has been talked about. There are low frequency variations, for instance, in the temperatures of the Atlantic Ocean, something called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, or the North Atlantic oscillation in the atmosphere. The retreat in Arctic sea ice in summer cannot be explained by these low frequency patterns of natural climate variability. It's primarily due to the decreases in the decreases in Arctic sea ice are primarily due to the increases in greenhouse gases causing warming in the climate system.
What does the most recent work tell us about what we can expect in the future? How close are we to a northern summer without ice?
That's very difficult to estimate because, as I've said before, the climate models, when we look at those, provide estimates of decreases in Arctic sea ice, and they're predicting slower decreases than we've actually observed. But if we just use the climate models alone, they would suggest that Arctic sea ice would disappear in September, which tends to be the minimum, sometime between about 2040 and 2070. There would be no Arctic sea ice in September. Given the recent observations, though, we know that the climate models are underestimating the rate of decrease. Based on the climate model simulations and the observed decreases, if we combine those to get ranges of uncertainties, some scientists have estimated that even in the next decade, if you like the 2010s, we might see periods of no Arctic sea ice. I think perhaps that's maybe an exaggeration. It's hard to tell, but it is certainly likely that sometime between the 2020s and the 2050s or 2060s, there will be Septembers with no Arctic sea ice. And because of this rapid feedback, when we have less Arctic sea ice, the next year or the next winter, it's thinner. It doesn't grow back as quickly. Thinner sea ice melts more rapidly the next season, the next summer. So this feedback cycle in terms of the sea ice growing back again means that the more melting there is, there's more decrease the following year. And so that's a feedback in itself, accelerating the decline. And that decline also accelerates the warming in the whole of the Arctic region because there's less sea ice to reflect sunlight out to space. So there are many complex feedbacks that accelerate the climate system at high latitudes.
I want to, broaden for a second. There was a recent paper that, if we can take it on face value, seems quite remarkable, and I don't think it's been properly examined and is not widely understood in the mainstream media, perhaps. And it was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. And if my understanding is correct, it basically said that climate changes due to rising greenhouse gas emissions are irreversible for 1,000 years, even once emissions stop completely, which obviously is not a situation we're anywhere near at the moment. We often hear that climate change is already locked into at least 2030. This suggests the situation is much worse than that.
Yep.
What are the ramifications of this?
There's lots of ramifications. It's interesting that it hasn't been covered well because there are certainly statements in the IPCC fourth assessment report, the sort of one-liners, maybe that didn't make headlines in newspapers, but that emissions of carbon dioxide in the 21st century will lead to global warming and sea level rise for the next millennium. So that was already in the IPCC. What Susan Solomon and her co-authors have talked about in this recent study was looking at how much of the temperature rises, sea level rise, and even rainfall changes in different parts of the globe would be locked in by increases in carbon dioxide. She, in her analysis, focused on carbon dioxide because the timescales for removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere are very, very long. The IPCC considers all greenhouse gases, and the most important ones, in addition to carbon dioxide, are methane and nitrous oxide. And there are destruction processes in the atmosphere and in the climate system for methane and nitrous oxide, chemical destruction processes. They can be removed. Carbon dioxide, however, is rather different. There's almost no destruction process for carbon dioxide in the Earth system. It gets recycled, it gets transformed, but it doesn't really disappear. What that means is that the timescale for carbon dioxide to be removed from the atmosphere is dependent upon the timescales for different processes in the carbon system. Some of those are quite rapid, removal of carbon dioxide into the upper regions of the ocean or into the plants in the terrestrial biosphere. But unfortunately, those fast reservoirs saturate very quickly. To remove it from those fast reservoirs takes much, much longer timescales. You have to remove it from essentially the plants into essentially deep soils, or you have to remove it from the upper layers of the ocean into sediments at the bottom of the ocean. That takes thousands of years to lock the carbon away into long-term storage. So that means that carbon dioxide concentrations, as they're increasing, when you stop emissions, they fall, but about 25% of what's being emitted stays in the atmosphere for 1,000 years, which means that concentrations go up, they fall a little bit, perhaps by 25 to 50, well, perhaps by 50%, but then stay that way for 1,000 years. And temperatures, because there's a lag for the temperatures behind the increases in carbon dioxide, if we only look at the temperature response to carbon dioxide alone, that temperature increases and then stays at roughly its peak value. As the concentrations of carbon dioxide fall, the temperature's still catching up, and then it basically stays the same. And the assessment that's been undertaken is that temperature responses to carbon dioxide will increase, peak, and then stay roughly the same for the next 500 to 1,000 years at something like 50% of the equilibrium temperature response to the carbon dioxide maximum in the atmosphere. What that means is, in terms of sea level rise, in terms of long-term temperature changes, and in terms of rainfall changes in parts of the world that are already dry, like southern Australia, the Mediterranean, and the southwest of the United States, we can expect semi-permanent decreases in rainfall for 500 or more years. Semi-permanent, almost irreversible temperature increases for 1,000 years, and sea level increases for 1,000 years, even if greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, are stopped instantly. And the amount of warming or the amount of climate change depends on when the emissions stop, because it depends on the peak concentrations in the atmosphere. The earlier you reduce the emissions, the sooner the peak is reached, and the lower is the peak, so the less irreversible climate change is manifested. The study is really important because it emphasises that earlier reductions in carbon dioxide emissions reduce the magnitude of this irreversible climate change. The other important point is that there have been, many, scenarios or trajectories for climate change and responses to climate change in the future, which have argued it is okay to overshoot a long-term stabilisation scenario because we can reduce emissions in the future and the climate system will remove the greenhouse gases, and therefore we can, if you like, overshoot and then come back down again. That overshoot scenario in terms of emissions is okay for methane and nitrous oxide because their timescales for removal are of the order of 10 to 100 years. An overshoot emissions trajectory or scenario for carbon dioxide doesn't quite work in the same way. Carbon dioxide emissions go up and will reduce a little bit, but the temperature response goes up and then flattens out, stays the same, essentially for 500 to 1,000 years or longer. An overshoot scenario is not possible for carbon dioxide, well, the climate change response to carbon dioxide.
And yet, if you talk to policymakers, everyone talks in terms of overshoot. Carbon dioxide's the main game, if you like, in terms of the greenhouse gases we're dealing with. So this still seems relatively poorly understood.
That's correct. There are a number of aspects of the climate science that are poorly understood by politicians, and to a large extent, I guess myself and other climate scientists have to take the blame because communicating climate science in simple language is our responsibility. It's not always, we can't expect politicians or even the advisors to politicians, or even other policymakers to necessarily understand the latest scientific papers. There is a related aspect of, if you like, policymakers' understanding of climate science to do with future emission scenarios and certain, if you like, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas stabilisation levels. And the European Union, through a number of different assessments, has argued that the world should seek to limit its combined carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that is around 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And that would lead to essentially a warming relative to pre-industrial of around 2 degrees Celsius, and that would seek to minimise dangerous anthropogenic climate change. Well, there are two parts of that simple message that are poorly understood. The first part of the message that is not well understood was that the concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere already in 2005 exceeded the level of 450 parts per million. They were in fact 455 parts per million of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere already in 2005. So the atmosphere already had more greenhouse gases in it than would lead to this, it will exceed this warming consistent with dangerous anthropogenic climate change. So the question is, well, why haven't we seen that already? And the reason is that there are other factors that are very important. The first one is that the warming of the climate system is lagged behind the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere due to the slow response in terms of warming of the oceans. And the second reason is that there's a major cooling factor in the atmosphere associated with human activity, and that's to do with the aerosols, or small particles and droplets in the atmosphere due to industrial activity, associated with haze that we see in cities, haze that we see over industrial areas, and haze also associated with fires and biomass burning. Those small particles reflect sunlight back out to space. They have a cooling influence on the climate system, and that's offsetting more than a third of the warming influence due to the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There's another aspect of the response that hasn't been well understood, and that is that instead of just thinking about what is the best estimate of the warming due to this greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, this best estimate of 2 degrees warming associated with 450 parts per million in the atmosphere, we probably should look at the full range of temperatures. And there is uncertainties associated with the feedbacks in the climate system that lead us to understand that there's a whole range of, if you like, global temperature responses with high confidence that the warming associated with 450 parts per million of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere would lead to a warming of more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial, 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial, or another 0.5 degree above present. Best estimate of about 2 to 2.4 degrees above pre-industrial, and still a risk of substantially warmer global average temperatures, even with just 450 parts per million in the atmosphere. And the upper ranges of that are probably, we can't rule out warmings of more than 4 degrees globally. So there is still a significant risk, and associated with those higher warmings are substantially higher adverse impacts. Global average warming of 3 degrees is likely to lead to melting of the Greenland ice sheet over long timescales of 300 to 500 years. Melting of the Greenland ice sheet will lead to 7 meters of sea level rise, and that cannot be ruled out. There is still a greater than 10% probability of that occurring, even if we were able to stabilise greenhouse gas concentrations at 450 parts per million, and we exceeded that level more than 5 years ago. So the adverse impacts and the risks of these adverse impacts has probably been not well communicated by climate scientists like myself.